thank you to Lisa and to Eric for inviting me to be here tonight to speak with all of you. It is my pleasure, and to all those who are joining us online tonight. What a spectacular way to celebrate the 50th anniversary of landing people on the moon with this lecture series. Just by a show of hands, how many have been able to attend some of the other ones that they've had? Oh, wow, excellent. So you're in for a treat. For those that weren't here for the other ones, you missed out on an excellent panel discussion by Apollo 17 astronaut Harrison Schmitt and the flight director, Jerry Griffin, giving a very personal account of their experiences from both the perspective of being on the moon and being on Earth. At the same time, we also heard from Clive Neal, a professor at Notre Dame University who had been studying lunar samples. And he had been awarded a grant recently to look at one of the pristine samples. So NASA saved some of the rocks that were brought back because they knew technology would advance. And so we wanted to be able to use that and at a later date. So he's got a grant to look at one of those samples. And then in April, we got to hear from Dr. John Grant about the habitability of Mars based on the instruments and the data we've been getting from the rovers that indicate that there's been a lot of water in the past on Mars, and that they probably haven't found life yet. It looks like we just have to look in the right places. So that was really interesting. So we got the human perspective, we got the science perspective. So today I'm bringing the engineering perspective. What I'm going to talk about is first, how we actually land these things on Mars, based on my experience being on the InSight lander team last November, and then how we use those experiences of the robotic missions to really look at what technologies we should be investing in now to make humans, delivering humans to the surface, a possibility in the future. And then with that perspective of, how we would do this for Mars, recently the president gave us the challenge to send people back to the moon in 5 years. So if we have that perspective and know what we need to do for those, what kinds of technologies can we make sure that we test at the moon so that we have them ready to go when we're ready to send humans. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. We're going to start then at Mars and work our way back. So this is what we call affectionately the family portrait of all of the missions we have sent to the planet. There's been about 45 over the last 6 decades. And if you look, the little tiny flags designate the country of origin. So we've had lots from the former Soviet Union, Japan, the European Space Agency, India, and of course the United States. But going to Mars is really hard, and we haven't done so well. If you can see by the X's, we have failed spectacularly many times, and we've succeeded. The check marks are the ones that have worked. And so if you look at out of 45 missions, 26 failures, isn't it really great odds for making it at Mars? But the 19 successes is where we hang our hats. So it's not a great it's a great batting average, but not a great engineering average here. So the reason it's so hard to go to Mars is, well, there's lots of reasons, but we're going to talk about a few. The first is it's really far away. So whatever spacecraft you build, it has to be able to live in space for a long time. The second thing is, in order for us to get it off of the Earth and into space, it needs a lot of energy. So we put them on rockets, and then for most of these, especially the landers, when the scientists don't want us to crash them, they want us to land them softly, we have to take all that energy out. And really the only place that we can do that effectively and efficiently is using the atmosphere at Mars. And so we're going to talk about some of the challenges we have there, because at Mars, the atmosphere at the surface is 1/100th of the atmosphere that we have here at Earth at the surface. So if you imagine, it's like trying to stop something moving 13,000 miles an hour at about 100,000 feet here at Earth. We don't really try to do that. Even ballistic missiles, we want them to hit accurately, but we don't want them to hit and stop. So it's a very different kind of problem that we're trying to solve. The other reason that it's so challenging is because it is so far away. We can't send things there and then, oh shoot, we didn't build the parachute big enough, we have to bring it back. You don't get those opportunities, right? It takes 8 months to get there. The planets only align every 2 years. That's just not practical. So you have to find another way to assess your systems before you send them. And we do that through ground testing, through flight testing here at Earth, but really we do a lot of it through simulation. And that's what my team primarily does for any of these spacecraft that go to other planets. So, because we can't send them to the other there and test them and bring them back, we have to create mathematical models of everything that could possibly affect that spacecraft when it's flying through the atmosphere. So everything like the atmosphere models, the aerodynamics that the vehicle experiences, mass properties, anything that we don't know exactly, we model it with our best guess, and then we put a little margin on for uncertainties and then a little bit more just to make sure we get whatever we don't know. And then we put those into simulations and we run them thousands and thousands of times. And we do that both during the design phase to help them size the parachute correctly, put enough propellant on board, and then we do it once it gets there to make sure we know where it's going to land. So we tell them with our best guess and all the information that we have from the spacecraft where it's at, our best prediction of where it's going to end up. And that's exactly what we did for the InSight mission. All right, so we're going to start by talking about exploring with InSight. So, because NASA likes acronyms, InSight is actually an acronym that I would never remember, so I wrote it up here. It is the interior exploration using seismic investigations, geodesy, and heat transport. Say that 10 times really fast. So this was a smaller mission. It was actually a refly of a mission we landed in 2008, the Phoenix lander. They repurposed it with new science and delivered it to the equator this time instead of the pole. The important thing that we're going to talk about tonight is how much mass it was. So at launch, it was about 1,500 pounds, or about 700 kilograms. When it landed, after we got rid of everything, and we'll talk about that, we ended up landing about 350 kilograms. And that was to deliver 60 kilograms of science. So that's the seismometer that you see there on the sides. It's measuring Mars quakes. And it's got a heat probe that will take the temperature at the planet. Because it's at the equator, it's solar powered. So you see the solar power arrays and the dimensions there. And because this was a Discovery class mission, it cost about $814 million. So this is your tax investment for this relatively smaller mission compared to what we'll talk about in a little bit. All right, so when you go and design a mission, there are lots of different parts of it. So we'll walk through each one here. Because this was a refly, it didn't take quite as long as some of our other missions to design and develop, but that part of it takes about 3 to 5 years. So you can see an image here of it being developed. And then when you launch it, it takes about 2 hours to get it off the surface and on its way, pointed in the right direction to Mars. That cruise then takes, depending on what launch vehicle you put it on, anywhere from 7 to 9 months to get there. And then there's a part of the mission where we come in, and we spend a lot of time designing what takes 6 minutes. Basically, it's the time it takes to slow it down from going the 13,000 miles an hour to 0 without making a hole in the ground. And so we call that entry, descent, and landing because it takes 3 different technologies to make this happen. And we'll get into the details of that. And then finally, there's the surface operations side of it. So once we land it and we haven't heard anything, we turn it over to the robotic drivers or the operators at the surface, and they take it from there. All right, so here's just some images. You saw this one before, but how do we, mechanically fold it all up to fit inside the protective capsule that it needs to survive entry? And these are just some images of that back shell. This is mated with the crew stage. It needs a little bit of propellant to direct it directly at Mars. And then there's that heat shield we put on to protect it from entry. And then we stack all these things up and we put it on top of a rocket for launch. And so here's an image of the InSight all stacked up on top of a rocket. It launched out of Vandenberg, California. It was the first Mars launch from the West Coast. And so this is what happens when it gets there. I have a little video. We'll see if it works. This is what happened last November.
InSight is now traveling at a velocity of 2,000 meters per second. InSight has passed through peak deceleration. Telemetry shows the spacecraft saw about 8 Gs. InSight should now be experiencing the peak heating rate. Ground stations are observing signals consistent with parachute deploy.
Marco Alpha, Marco Bravo, maintain lock status.
Altitude convergence, the radar has locked on the ground.
Yes.
Standing by for lander separation. Lander separation commanded. Altitude 600 meters. Altitude 400 meters. 200 meters. 80 meters. 60 meters. 30 meters. 20 meters. 17 meters. Standing by for touchdown. Touchdown confirmed.
So we're a little happy when that happens because we don't really know when we start out if it's gonna work. And the other challenge that I didn't mention was that because we're so far away, it takes about 7 minutes for a signal to make it from here to Mars, and then another 7 minutes to make it back. So by the time we got that information, it was done. Whether it was good or bad, we weren't going to know until we got all the signals back. And we didn't have those images that you saw were really animations because there was no, second mission filming it as it went in. That would have been awesome, but it wasn't. And in fact, if we wouldn't have had the two little spacecraft that flew past the planet at the same time, we wouldn't have even gotten that information until about an hour later. But because there's that very small bandwidth of time, all we do is we have the spacecraft send us little text messages that says, I'm at this altitude, I'm at this velocity. So when you heard her reading those things out, those were the signals we were getting back. That's all we knew what was happening. We spend the next few months reconstructing it to see how well we did compared to our predictions. But talking about predictions, here we go. So this is where we thought we were going to land. The blue circle is what we call a landing ellipse. We think it could land anywhere in there within a 99% probability. And that was the ellipse we had about a week before entry. And then the day of entry, we had a better idea of where that spacecraft was, so it shrunk it a little bit. But if you look at the scale, we're still talking 10 kilometers right there. So this is about a 60-kilometer. You're talking a very large parking lot type of place we were trying to land. The target was the middle. We ended up landing right over there. So, we hit our target within the probability. So. All right, well, that's what it took to land the 350 kilograms. And that was, like I said, a refly of a mission that we had done in 2007. So in 2012, we landed something different, the Curiosity rover. I don't know if anybody is familiar with this one as well, but it was about 3 times the mass of the InSight lander. So here we have, I've switched everything to kilograms. You're going to have to do the conversions on your own. So we're talking, we'll keep it in, so a 350 kilogram InSight lander, we're now at 900 kilograms for Curiosity. It was a rover. It landed on its wheels. We had lots of discussions about whether you put the rockets below it, how does it drive off, all those different kinds of ways. But because it was so much heavier, we had to design things a little bit differently. And this was to land 75 kilograms. And its primary mission was to drive up a mountain. So it had a significantly different objectives. So here's just some pictures of the rover itself. Being built before it was sent. And then, like I said, we didn't put the engines below it. We created something new this time. It was called the Sky Crane. And it's basically a jetpack that we put on this. And it lowered the rover to the surface. And so this is an image of that. The other thing we finally got to do with this mission was for the poor engineers who send these and we never instrument the things that we jettison. But we never know, like for the amount of thermal protection system we put on there, if we almost burned through and it was almost a bad day, or if we had so much there, we should have, made it a little lighter and put more science on board. So for the first time at this mission, we were able to instrument it, and that's what you see those wires on the heat shield. The other thing we wanted to do, this is just showing how it's packed up and folded up in there. There's a little tiny camera on the bottom of the rover. And the scientists are like, why do you want to put a camera on the bottom of the rover? That's not what we want. But we're like, no, this is really important for us, because when we're coming in, this was the first mission we were going to get to video. We were going to get video back. We wouldn't get it the same day, but we would download it later. But we wanted to see if when we separated that heat shield, if it was, dynamic and going to come back and hit us, or if it fell away really nicely. We also wanted to see when we looked down at the ground, when we got close, were those rocket engines that were still 20 meters above us, were they throwing rocks? How did it affect the surface below us? So the scientists thought we were crazy wanting to put a camera on the bottom of the rover, but they let us do it this one time, and it turned out it was amazing, some of the things we got to see from that. So this is the hull of Curiosity stacked up. You can see all the pieces folded up in there. Again, we put it on a rocket. Obviously, there's a lot of space left in this one, but it was heavy enough it needed a little bit bigger rocket. We loaded it up, and we launched Thanksgiving in 2011. All right. So again, this one had a little bit longer design time because it wasn't a refly. This was the first time we had done any of this. The launch again took 2 hours to get there. It took my family when they were little back then. Again, it took about eight and a half months to get to Mars. And then we had to do the whole 7 minutes of what we called terror at this point, where you had to survive the entry, the descent, and then the landing on the sky crane. It was something we'd never tried before, but we had to do this in order to land just 3 times as much mass. All those things we tried before didn't work. It's got a bigger aeroshell, bigger parachute, and then, of course, surface operations. Now, for this mission, it's supposed to last about 3 years. Of course, it landed in 2012, and it's still plugging away. So it's still working. So I showed you the video of what we thought and what did happen for InSight. Now I'm going to show you a quick video of how different things had to be to work for Curiosity. It's a little dramatic. Stay with me here.
When people look at it, it looks crazy. That's a very natural thing. Sometimes when we look at it, it looks crazy. It is the result of reasoned engineering thought, but it still looks crazy. From the top of the atmosphere down to the surface, it takes us 7 minutes. It takes 14 minutes or so for the signal from the spacecraft to make it to Earth. That's how far Mars is away from us. So when we first get word that we've touched the top of the atmosphere, the vehicle has been alive or dead on the surface for at least 7 minutes.
Entry, descent, and landing, also known as EDL, is referred to as the 7 minutes of terror, because we've got literally 7 minutes to get from the top of the atmosphere to the surface of Mars, going from 13,000 miles an hour to 0 in perfect sequence, perfect choreography, perfect timing, and the computer has to do it all by itself with no help from the ground. If any one thing doesn't work just right, it's game over.
We slam into the atmosphere and develop so much aerodynamic drag. Our heat shield, it heats up and it glows like the surface of the sun. 1,600 degrees.
During entry, the vehicle is not only slowing down violently through the atmosphere, but also we are guiding it like an airplane to be able to land in a very narrow, constrained space. This is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing, and one that we had never attempted on Mars.
Mars is actually really hard to slow down. because it has just enough atmosphere that you have to deal with it. Otherwise, it will destroy your spacecraft. On the other hand, it doesn't have enough atmosphere to finish the job. We're still going about 1,000 miles an hour. So at that point, we use a parachute.
The parachute is the largest and strongest supersonic parachute that we've ever built to date. It has to be able to withstand 65,000 pounds of force, even though the parachute itself only weighs about 100 pounds.
When it opens up that fast, it's a neck-snapping 9 Gs.
At that point, we have to get that heat shield off. It's like a big lens cap blocking our view of the ground to the radar. The radar has to take just the right altitude and velocity measurements at just the right time, or the rest of the landing sequence won't work.
This big, huge parachute that we've got, it will only slow us down to about 200 miles an hour. And that's not slow enough to land. So we have no choice, but we've got to cut it off and then come down in rockets. Once we turn those rocket motors on, if we don't do something, we're just going to smack right back into the parachute. So the first thing we do is make this really radical divert maneuver. We fly off to the side.
Diverting away from the parachute, killing our horizontal velocity and our vertical velocity, getting the rover moving straight up and down so it can look at the surface with its radar and see where we're going to land. And we head straight down to the bottom of a crater, right beside a 6-kilometer high mountain.
We can't get those rocket engines too close to the ground, because if we were to descend propulsively with our engines all the way to the ground, we would essentially create this massive dust cloud. That dust cloud could then go and land on the rover. It could damage mechanisms and it could damage instruments. So the way we solve that problem is by using the sky crane maneuver.
20 meters above the surface, we have to lower the rover below us on a tether that's 21 feet long, and then gently deposit it on its wheels on the surface.
As the rover touches down and is now on the ground, the descent stage is in a collision course with the rover. We must cut the bridle immediately and fly the descent stage to a safe distance from the rover.
What could possibly go wrong, right? And you already saw the spoiler, holy crap, it worked. And there we are. Well, you can hold your breath for 7 minutes. So how did we do? This was, as they mentioned, now here's our 10-kilometer scale. We were trying to land in something about 12 to 15 kilometers. We ended up about 2 kilometers away from our target. So with the way we redesigned this, it worked spectacularly. And we also have a picture of the orbiters going around. We're able to take images, and you can see where it's kind of sandblasted the surface. Here's where the back shell and parachute landed, the heat shield, and then the sky crane crashed over there. So we got a good image of everything on the surface. And of course, then it took all the cameras and took different pictures of the vehicle. And no journey of 300 million miles is complete without a selfie. So it stuck its arm out and took a picture. So it's been working great. We had lots of conversations with the scientists about, how close could we land to the mountain. They didn't want to spend their whole time driving to the mountain, but we were like, we really don't want to crash into the mountain. So there was a lot of discussions between the scientists and engineers about how we picked those locations. So what's coming up next? Next year, we're going to actually launch another Curiosity-like rover. This is going to have some little different payload. The point of this mission is to actually go get rocks, interesting samples, and cache them so that we can go send another mission to go pick them up and bring them back. So this is the first in the sample return series. The other thing it's going to do is try to fly a helicopter on Mars for the first time. Now, I told you, it's like flying at 100,000 feet. There's not too many helicopters that can do that. So this was a lot of technology investment to make that happen too. But the other thing that we're doing is there is going to be a sensor on 2020 called MOXIE. And what it's going to do for the first time is try to take the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and break it apart into carbon and oxygen. And the reason we want to see if that's possible is because if we ever wanted to go there, we could make oxygen and propellant or oxygen to breathe from the atmosphere. Or it's the first step in looking at using the resources on the planet to start being able to use them for either another rocket or human consumption. So that's another big thing that's going to happen on 2020. So we just talked about what it took to land 350 kilograms, and then what it took to land 900 kilograms. And so now we're starting to talk about how do we send humans. And the difficulty with humans is that they like their food, and they like a place to stay, and they like to be warm, and they like to breathe. And these are all things that the robots don't care about. So they have a lot more stuff that they want to take with them. And so before we start talking about why you would want to ship all that stuff to Mars, let's talk about why we would want to send people in the first place. So this is the map of Curiosity's track as it was making its way towards the mountain there in Gale Crater. In 2012, we said it landed. Now, in 2015, on day about 1,000, it had gone about 10 kilometers. It's about 6.2 miles. So it took a long time to go 10 kilometers. If we look at how long it took to drive that distance, and we compare that to some of the lunar missions for which we took people, we'll look at the robotic missions first. So Curiosity, and this is a little bit later, when it had gone 15 kilometers, it took about 500 hours of driving to get that far. And it's great. It did a lot of great science along the way, but it just took a long time to go 15 kilometers. Opportunity landed in 2004, and until last fall, or last summer, was working great. And this is just a snapshot in time of when it had gone 43 kilometers. It took about 1,200 hours to get there of its drive time. Now we compare that to some of the Apollo missions where they had the little lunar buggy, and they had people like Jack Schmitt who could go and say, that's an interesting rock, I want to pick that one up. They drove about 31 kilometers, and they did it in about 5 hours. Likewise, Apollo 16, you can see 30 kilometers in about 4 hours, and Apollo 15, about 30 kilometers in the same amount of time. The point is, humans can do a lot more quickly. And we talked to the Opportunity principal investigator, and we said, you know what, it was there for that many years, and it covered a lot of ground, but if you were there, how long would it take you to do what they did, and what that robot did? And he said, about a week. So everything that robot did in 14 years, you think a human could do in about a week. So it starts to give you a perspective of why you would bother shipping all the things people like to have to Mars. So we've done an assessment, and we said, okay, well, if you do want to send people, they're going to need a certain amount of things to live, and that comes out to be about 20 to 40 metric tons, or 20,000 to 40,000 kilograms. I just told you what trouble we had getting 900 kilograms on. So now we got to figure out how to do this, because your parachutes aren't going to work anymore. Your sky crane's not going to work anymore. We got to come up with new technologies that will let us deliver people and all their stuff. And so we thought about how we want to do this. First of all, we looked at how we would package all these different things. So we said, okay, well, they need some power, and they need a rover, and maybe some logistic stuff, and at NASA we're going to bring people back, so we're going to have a Mars ascent vehicle. So we have that takes up one whole lander. Logistics, the food, the tools, and another rover, and then finally their habitat, what they will live in. And we think we could get them on 4 20-ton landers, so they'd all have to land in a relatively small landing location. And we're looking at things like the shuttle. The shuttle-like vehicles, but since it has low atmosphere, we don't want to take the weight of the wings, so we hacked off the wings, and we're looking at vehicles that look like that. And we're also looking at kind of flying saucer-like vehicles. This is because the launch vehicle we're assuming has about a 10-meter diameter launch shroud. But if we can't use parachutes, we need some way to get our drag area that's beyond the 10 meters. And we're looking at doing that with these inflatable structures that allow us to make that a much bigger surface area there. So those are 2 types of vehicles we're looking at. Now, if I compare, well, this is one of the entry concepts for the inflatable. We would just use propellant to land us at the end, only the challenge here is we're starting those engines at supersonic speeds instead of subsonic speeds, which is a huge challenge. But once you land, you retract this, and then you can do the offloading. Again, likewise, this would be kind of the landing sequence for this type of vehicle. So this is one element of the technology that we're looking at to deliver humans. Now, you want to look at how this compares to those other capsules. This is roughly to scale. So all of our other missions have been these capsules, the biggest one was 4.5 meters in diameter. These we're looking at 16 meters, 20 meters. I mean, you look down the hallway here and see about 20. Yeah, these things are very big to deliver all those elements, and very heavy when you talk about entry masses and landed masses just to deliver the payload. So not only do we need hardware advances, but we also have to have some software advances as well. As I mentioned, all the previous missions had these very large footprints, and even though we did really well with Curiosity, and we hope to improve that landing ellipse for 2020, people don't like to walk 12 kilometers to go get their logistics off the other lander that landed over there. So they're telling us, we want you to land in 50 meters. That's a whole nother challenge. So now we have to start looking at, so we could steer this to within 10 kilometers, what would it take to get us within 50 meters? And so we've had to rethink how we would do that entry, descent, and landing for this. And so the first thing is we're not going to jettison all those things because they're going to hit all the other things we want to sit on the surface. So that's bad. We wanted to land within the 50 meters, and because we're going to have those engines at the bottom throwing up all that dirt, we don't want it to land within a kilometer. Our analysis is showing that it's going to throw those rocks up to 700 meters. So the closest we can land to something else is about a kilometer right now. So this is the Jezero Crater landing site for 2020, where it wants to go. And we said, well, if we're going to do all our sample return here and we want to send humans here, could we send them somewhere like a notional landing zone at the same location? How would we deliver all 4 of those payloads to this location? So this is that little white box enlarged here. There's your scale, 1 kilometer. And the yellow dots are 50-meter radius circles, and the big blue ones are the 1 kilometer radius circles. So it looks like in this box we could land about 6 landers. And so we put together, so that would be like the sample return technology demonstration, and then we could squeeze in all these other ones around, maybe send one crew back and bring another crew, and they could utilize the same infrastructure that we had established there. And so this is kind of the concept that we're looking at for these lunar mission, for the Mars missions. And so we're going back to now talk about what it would take to land these human scale missions at the moon. And we say, okay, well, we know there's a lot of differences between Mars and the moon, but some of these things like landing in the 50 meters, we could demonstrate that at the moon. Some of the propellant types that we want to use with making the ISRU, the oxygen, and those propellants, we could test those at the moon. So there's a lot of things we could test at the moon. So I'll go quickly through what the plan is. We're still developing this. As I mentioned, the president challenged us to send people back in 5 years and permanently in the next decade. So you can go to Louisiana now and see this giant rocket being built. This is a Space Launch System. We've also did the first flight test of the Orion vehicle. So if you want to compare Orion to the Apollo capsule, you can see the differences here. It's bigger, it holds more people, it can take 6 people to the ISS, it can take 4 people to the moon. So this is kind of the comparison. These are things that NASA's working on. And the big difference now for going to the moon is that we want to stay. And so one way that we do that is we put something like a small International Space Station in orbit around the moon, so that people could take SLS and Orion and go to the gateway, and then they would dock there with, and there would already be their descent stage and their ascent stage to the surface of the moon already there. And then we could refuel it there as well. So you're not bringing all those pieces back and forth to the Earth. You're leaving some of those essential elements right there around the moon, and just the people go back and forth. And so we're designing those elements that go to the surface and coming back up, as well as this right now. And so we're, with how they want to do this, it hasn't been decided if Gateway is going to go first, if we have to send people there in 2024, or if it will be part of the permanent establishment. But this is kind of how we're rethinking going back to the moon. It's not those sortie missions, and then if you go from Gateway, you can stay on the surface for up to a week, and then you could go back up. So you get a lot more time to spend there. It really changes the way that you think of exploration on the moon. So I'm almost out of time here, so I wanted to leave you with one last little video clip of, people don't know that this stuff is actually happening right now, and you can go see it. Who's ready to go to the moon? Thank you.
All right, if you have questions, I'll come by with the microphone, and I'll start up here on the east side. Brad, let me go up to Nick here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just wondered, obviously, with all the private companies getting into this, SpaceX, and a lot of money going into that, and that's what's looks like it's going to take us to and from the International Space Station. Will they play a part in this process to the moon, or is this totally going to be government run?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes, they're going to play a big part in it. And so there's already been an award for 9 different companies to look at the robotic missions, and through the commercial payload, lunar payload services, CLPS. And so they're looking at, testing out some of these technologies that we need. We know we're going to need for the human missions on some of the early missions, hopefully in the next 2 years or so. So yes, there is that. We're also looking at, being able to use different launch providers. If there are smaller elements that need to go up, we'd use the SLS for the big ones, and then see if we can do a mixed fleet to get the other ones up. There's also what we call a broad agency announcement out right now for those private companies to propose what they would like to see as, that descent stage and ascent stage elements, how they would design them, those kind of things. So there's a lot of community, commercial involvement, and, NASA's been kind of doing their homework to see what they think it should look like, and we'll continue to work on that.
So follow up to that question, as you're well aware, SLS has been delayed and delayed and delayed, and it's just recently been delayed again. A few months ago, your administrator said, we're not going to use SLS. We're going to rely on a different heavy launch system, and then changed his mind 2 weeks later and said, no, yes, we are going to use SLS. So I'm going to get you in a lot of trouble and ask you, what's your opinion? How are they going to get this off the ground?
Well, I will reiterate what the administrator has told us. when the president let us know that he wanted the people there in 5 years, then the administrator was going to go back to Congress and see if we couldn't do what we could to advance that schedule. And if, like I said, we're kind of still churning on how that's going to happen. But your skepticism is not alone.
Alicia, about midway back in the room here.
Sure.
Hi. The ISS benefits from Earth's atmosphere for radiation protection. How will the gateway, how will we provide long-term radiation protection for our lunar gateway?
That's a great question. And that is not something I know the answer to. I know they're working on that problem right now. I don't know what the option space is for that. Sorry.
In one of your earlier slides, it listed quite a few, hundreds of this and thousands of that. So there was 1 gazillion lines of code.
Yes.
Did I catch that the letter E in the word code was backwards?
Artistic liberties in the video. Maybe. I never noticed it.
All right, I have a question. Now, on your landers, were you in orbit first around Mars and then going from that down? Because that would be a different
Right
than
now.
if you did just right to the planet.
You're right. So we do have a mission that we have as a reference right now, and it does include 2 different concepts. One is to go into what we call a 5-sol orbit, so an orbit that takes 5 days to go around Mars. And in that case, it would be put into that orbit by using a solar electric propulsion stage. Now, we do have a different concept that we're looking at that does include an aero capture, where we would fly through the atmosphere to get us into a one day around Mars orbit. So they're trades that we're looking at. You design the vehicle a little bit differently for the different scenarios, but we would not plan to go direct right now.
Alicia, we have a question towards the back of the
Sure.
room on your right. Before we go to that, though, I just want to remind our worldwide live stream viewers that if they have a question, they can type in their question at livestream.com or on the Linda Hall Library Facebook page, and I will read them.
You mentioned some differences between your engineering team and the science team. I wondered if you could expand on those differences in your goals and how you negotiate them. And then secondly, how in the world do you do this work remotely from Lee Summit with 4 children?
I'll answer the second question first, and then I'll come back to the first one. Because I mentioned that so much of our work is done on computer, my particular job is done, writing code and on computer. As long as I have a high-speed internet connection, I can access the servers and the proper security to get in. So the situation that I'm in was that my husband was doing residency in Virginia and then owed the government back 3 years for a scholarship in an underserved area of the country. And nothing in Virginia, where I was stationed, qualified. So since I'm from Nebraska and he's from Kansas City, we said, would you let me work from home for that 3 years he has to pay it back? And they said, okay, we'll let you try it. And then after the 3 years, he had a couple years for loan repayments, and they said, okay, you can stay. Well, that was 13 years ago. So it's worked out really good for me, and we're gonna go with that. We're right here by family, and so it makes a huge difference for us, and I really do appreciate that NASA is flexible like that. To your first question about how science and engineers, how we do these trade studies, right? It's a conversation, and it's sometimes very lively conversations about, for example, the one about landing close to the mountain. We didn't want to land too close to the mountain because we didn't really want to crash into it, but the scientists didn't want to drive very far. They didn't want to spend their whole mission driving. So yes, we do have lots of those conversations where we have to do the cost-benefit analysis. There are other things like, we say, if you really want to go to this altitude and all your science is at a really high altitude, it's going to take us more propellant to slow down. Are you willing to offload one of your science experiments to give us that mass? And so then we have that conversation. And it's it's ongoing. Every mission has different examples of that, but we come to a design that closes and then we move on. Thanks. Yes.
Hi. What criteria do you have for those looking to live on the moon and on Mars?
I think if you go on the NASA website and you look at the astronaut criteria, I think they have outlined those to currently include at least the lunar ones. I don't know. They are doing experiments all over the world, actually, on how to live with the time delay at Mars. And so I don't know that we have a list of requirements yet for that one. But I think we do have for the lunar ones, or making those. Yeah.
What is the projected expense on this Mars trip?
Oh, that's a hard question. I don't think I can answer that. We haven't looked at, they don't let us cost numbers, things like this. We let the Office of Budget do that for us.
There was a hand up over here. I lost. There, here you go.
How much opportunity do you have to upgrade code while the thing's on its way? You got 8.5 months. Can you find bugs, fix them, and is that a constant thing you do?
That's a really interesting question, because the InSight mission was, as I mentioned, a refly, and they wanted to refly as much of the Phoenix code. It was a refly of the Phoenix mission. They didn't want us to change hardly anything. So if we do find a mistake, we can, but they're usually, they freeze the code at some point before the mission, and then it takes a board to review it and accept the change if they do make it. But most of the time, all through the development phase, we are allowed to change it, but there is a fixed time before the landing that we do. Now, I will say, we were running those trajectory simulations for InSight up to the morning before, because we would continue to get updated states. So we were still using the code and running it, but we were not making changes at that point. So, yes.
We have a question on Facebook from Lucas. Do you know a Lucas?
I do know a Lucas.
He wants to know what he can have for dessert.
Yeah. Thank you, Lucas. There are cookies in the cupboard.
Okay. If he's watching, he heard that. So we have a question back here.
What are the advantages of a lunar gateway when compared to a facility on the surface of the moon?
Could you repeat your question? I didn't hear the first part.
What are the advantages of the lunar gateway when compared to a facility that's actually on the surface of the moon?
I think a lot of it is the timing. It would allow us to start to build that infrastructure where you could have people go down and come back up, where we don't know where the resources are exactly. We don't know how we're going to process them. And so by the time you take get the whole surface element developed, it would take, it's going to take a series of years. Where if we want to go back sooner and start exploring around to find where the right places to put all these, new outposts should be, it offers us that kind of temporary back and forth. It also opens it up to our foreign partners, where, they might have science experiments and things they want to do that don't include a whole base. And so they don't want to go and spend that much time there. So it offers a flexibility that we just didn't have in the past. Yes?
I just recently, within the last month or so, watched a show on PBS, and I do not recall the name of it, but it was focusing on the human elements of space travel. And it was something to the effect titled "Living Men in Space" or "Humans in Space," something like that. And this was just in the period of the International Space Station, and they talked about the nausea and the muscle deterioration and all of those things that are not easily engineered. And I'm wondering, what are they expecting? One of the astronauts even said that in his opinion, we should not be putting people towards Mars. We should send machines. And I'm wondering if there's any idea of how that's going to affect people.
That's a great question. So I'm not going to lie, I focus on the engineering things that don't breathe and don't need stuff like that. So we agree that is a huge challenge. And while there are very smart people trying to solve that problem, we're trying to solve how we're going to put them on the surface. But the other thing is, I mean, that's just in case you don't know, there's a lot more problems. We don't know how to make food last 10 years. In radiatives, in the radiative environment of space either. So yes, the human concerns are plenty, and they have not solved all those, and they are working on those all the time. But there's a lot of other technical challenges that we haven't really addressed. Another one is at Mars with the sky being red because of all the dust. The physicians and the scientists are really afraid that it's going to mess up circadian rhythms, and you're not going to know what day and night is, even though a day on Mars is only 39 minutes longer than it is here on Earth. So I'm not going to lie, there's a lot of challenges that have to be met, and the human physiological ones are big on the list, but we have a long list. So,
Alicia, back here on your left.
Yes, I think I noticed on one of your slides that one of the elements of the payloads is plutonium as an energy source. And I'm curious what precautions are necessary and being taken in case things don't go quite as planned.
That's a good question. So the Curiosity rover, because it did have to drive up and down a mountain, we didn't know if it was going to, be able to see the sun and use those solar. It would need giant solar arrays too. The Curiosity rover does have a nuclear power source that is supposed to be good for up to 10 years. It is completely encased in a protective unit. They take all sorts of precautions when they launch it to put it on as one of the last elements in the spacecraft. So while I don't know the details of all the things that go into that, I just know that they do build the protection into the casing itself as much as they can, since it was a closed vehicle. Yeah.
Alicia, we have a question in the back of the room, and due to the time, let's do 2 more questions. We've got a question here, and a young man up a few rows on your left has a question. We'll end with that question.
In terms of once we start exploring, sending people to Mars and such, where do possibly Phobos and Deimos fall in that, possibly setting up a station there in orbit?
That is a great question. I just got a paper to review on that today. So it seems like it'd be the obvious place to start, right? You have Phobos and Deimos. They're in an equatorial orbit around the 2 moons of Mars. One is in, I'm going to have to remember. One's like in a 23,000 kilometer orbit, and one's in a much smaller, like a 6,000 kilometer orbit. The problem with using them as like a waypoint, lots of people want to stop there and then go into